The sun was merciless. It pressed down on the flat horizon like molten brass, burning through the haze of midday. A military transport train screeched to a halt near a barbed wire compound, surrounded by guard towers and wind-blown dust. American soldiers waited in silence, rifles slung at ease, their shadows long against the gravel. From the train cars stepped a small group of women, German auxiliaries captured in Europe and North Africa. Their faces were drawn, uniforms tattered, boots cracked from weeks of travel. Some clutched rosaries. Others held nothing at all. They had crossed an ocean in silence, carried by a war they no longer understood. Orders came sharply, echoed through interpreters. They were to undress. Confusion rippled through the line. Fear, humiliation, disbelief. But this was no punishment. Inside a nearby tent, medics prepared vats of disinfectant and crates of clean American clothing. The women obeyed in stunned quiet, stripped of their uniforms, and were led through delousing procedures designed to prevent disease. Minutes later, they were handed clean garments, cotton dresses, underclothes, soap, and towels. Not a word of cruelty was spoken. Only the rustle of fabric and the heavy Texas wind filled the air. They had arrived as prisoners. Yet what awaited them was something far more complex than captivity. But how did German women, once part of Hitler's war machine, find themselves under the Texan sun, facing a humanity they had been taught did not exist? By 1943, the tides of war had shifted. North Africa had fallen. Italy was cracking under invasion. And across the Atlantic, the United States, once an observer, had become the arsenal of democracy. With victories came prisoners. Tens of thousands of Axis soldiers captured in Tunisia, Sicily, and later in France. Within months, Allied ports were flooded with POWs, so many that Europe could no longer hold them safely. The U.S. made an unexpected decision to bring them home. Between 1942 and 1946, over 425,000 Axis prisoners of war were shipped to the United States. They came from the battlefields of Africa, the beaches of Normandy, and the skies over Italy. Texas became one of the central hubs. Its vast open land, mild winters, and existing military infrastructure made it ideal. More than 70 POW camps were built across the state, sprawling compounds surrounded by barbed wire and pine. These were not the brutal prison camps of Europe. They were tightly run military facilities, operated under the 1929 Geneva Convention, which guaranteed fair treatment to prisoners. They were fed 3 meals a day, given medical care, and allowed correspondence with home. Yet behind the legal framework lay human contradiction. These men, and the small number of women among them, were enemies of the nation that now sheltered them. The presence of female German prisoners in America was rare, almost anomalous. Most were members of the Wehrmacht's female auxiliaries, the Helferinnen, who had worked as radio operators, clerks, or nurses supporting the Nazi military apparatus. Some had been captured alongside male units in North Africa, others near the war's end as Germany collapsed. A handful were civilian internees, wives, secretaries, or nurses seized from German merchant ships and diplomatic missions caught abroad when war broke out. They were not soldiers in the conventional sense, but under wartime policy, they were detained as enemy nationals. Many were sent to the same transport ships that carried male POWs across the Atlantic. Packed into cargo holds refitted for human passage, they spent weeks at sea, escorted by destroyers to guard against U-boat attack. For the American public, the idea of German prisoners on U.S. soil was unsettling. Newspaper columns debated it fiercely. Why house the enemy in comfort while American boys died overseas? Yet the War Department had a practical logic. The prisoners could be put to work. Under strict supervision, they labored on farms, in sawmills, and canning factories, replacing American men sent to war. Texas farmers, desperate for manpower, quietly welcomed them. Most of the German men were housed in large compounds such as Camp Hearn, Camp Huntsville, and Camp Swift, each holding thousands. But women, far fewer in number, were separated into smaller, ventilated quarters, guarded by both male and female military personnel. For them, captivity in Texas was a bewildering inversion of everything they had been taught. Nazi propaganda had depicted Americans as decadent and cruel. Yet what they found was order, civility, and most surprising of all, kindness within discipline. The U.S. Army's policy was clear. Prisoners would be treated not as enemies, but as future citizens of peace. The War Department believed that humane treatment could serve as psychological warfare, a moral contrast to Nazi brutality. The camps reflected that principle. Prisoners attended English classes, watched Hollywood films, and even published their own newsletters. At Camp Herne, German engineers built model bridges from scrap wood. Musicians performed Bach on makeshift violins. The irony was inescapable. Behind barbed wire, Germans were living more safely than many civilians in bombed-out Berlin. Still, the psychological weight of captivity was heavy. Letters from home arrived sporadically, often censored or incomplete. Many women prisoners, secretaries, nurses, clerks, carried quiet guilt for their roles in Hitler's machine. Others felt relief simply to be alive, far from the chaos consuming Europe. And then came the day of delousing, the event that would etch itself into memory. As part of the U.S. Army's strict hygiene protocols, all new arrivals were stripped of their uniforms and passed through medical inspection. It was routine, designed to prevent lice, typhus, and disease. But for the women, it carried deeper humiliation. The order to undress before foreign soldiers echoed memories of occupation, defeat, and exposure. Yet what followed was something entirely unexpected. The women were not mocked. They were not photographed or abused. Instead, they were handed fresh American clothing, soft cotton dresses unlike anything they had worn in years of war. Soap towels and hygiene kits followed. For many, it was the first time in months they had bathed in clean water. In that moment, the moral dimensions of captivity blurred. These women had crossed the ocean as defeated enemies, but were being treated with a dignity absent from the world they had served. It was here, in the heat of Texas, under the unblinking eyes of guards and the vast American sky, that their understanding of war began to fracture. They were prisoners, but they were also witnesses to a civilization that did not mirror the hatred they had been taught to believe in. And it was within these camps, through daily labor, shared songs, and quiet conversations across the fence, that a deeper story began to unfold. They had arrived broken by distance, carrying only fragments of identity left from the ruins of Europe. Many were in their 20s, secretaries, nurses, clerks of the Reich, who had enlisted believing they were serving their nation, not its ideology. Now they stood behind American wire, trying to understand a war that had turned them into symbols of defeat. In the evenings, they watched the sun fall beyond the Texan plains, its color reminding them of the fires over Hamburg and Cologne. It was here, among strangers, that their humanity slowly resurfaced. For the first time, they were seen not as functionaries of tyranny, but as young women displaced by history. The guards' restraint, the provision of food and shelter, the medical care, all these ordinary acts began to dismantle what years of propaganda had built. To them, kindness felt alien, almost dangerous. Beneath this quiet surface, the camp was a machine of precision. Every action was recorded, every rule enforced with military efficiency. The U.S. Army ran its POW system as a model of discipline and legality. These women were part of an operation that stretched from the docks of New York to the cotton fields of Texas. Prisoners were cataloged, medically inspected, and assigned identification numbers. They were paid in coupons rather than money, worked regulated hours, and answered to American non-commissioned officers who understood the balance between control and respect. For the War Department, these camps were not just holding centers. They were symbols of moral superiority. In the shadow of global atrocities, America sought to prove that civilization could exist even in victory. Amid this discipline, the delousing and inspection rituals became both necessity and symbol. Disease was a silent enemy that haunted armies on every continent. Typhus, carried by lice, had devastated Europe's camps and front lines. The U.S. military's hygiene procedures were strict. Upon arrival, prisoners were ordered to undress, their clothing fumigated with DDT powder, their bodies checked for infection. To the German women, the experience was terrifying, an echo of vulnerability. Yet the American medics, often young nurses themselves, treated them clinically, not cruelly. The act of being given clean clothes, cotton dresses, and soap was more than sanitation. It was an introduction to another moral world. Within that simple exchange, the power dynamic shifted. These women, stripped of uniform and insignia, were no longer soldiers or enemies. They were simply human beings under care. That humanity carried moral tension of its own, a story not of battles or victories, but of the strange humanity that survived inside barbed wire. They had arrived broken by distance, carrying only fragments of identity left from the ruins of Europe. Many were in their 20s, secretaries, nurses, clerks of the Reich, who had enlisted believing they were serving their nation, not its ideology. Now they stood behind American wire, trying to understand a war that had turned them into symbols of defeat. In the evenings, they watched the sun fall beyond the Texan plains, its color reminding them of the fires over Hamburg and Cologne. It was here, among strangers, that their humanity slowly resurfaced. For the first time, they were seen not as functionaries of tyranny, but as young women displaced by history. The guards' restraint, the provision of food and shelter, the medical care, all these ordinary acts began to dismantle what years of propaganda had built. To them, kindness felt alien, almost dangerous. Beneath this quiet surface, the camp was a machine of precision. Every action was recorded, every rule enforced with military efficiency. The U.S. Army ran its POW system as a model of discipline and legality. These women were part of an operation that stretched from the docks of New York to the cotton fields of Texas. Prisoners were cataloged, medically inspected, and assigned identification numbers. They were paid in coupons rather than money, worked regulated hours, and answered to American non-commissioned officers who understood the balance between control and respect. For the War Department, these camps were not just holding centers. They were symbols of moral superiority. In the shadow of global atrocities, America sought to prove that civilization could exist even in victory. Amid this discipline, the delousing and inspection rituals became both necessity and symbol. Disease was a silent enemy that haunted armies on every continent. Divus carried by lice had devastated Europe's camps and front lines. The U.S. military's hygiene procedures were strict. Upon arrival, prisoners were ordered to undress, their clothing fumigated with DDT powder, their bodies checked for infection. To the German women, the experience was terrifying, an echo of vulnerability. Yet the American medics, often young nurses themselves, treated them clinically, not cruelly. The act of being given clean clothes, cotton dresses, and soap was more than sanitation. It was an introduction to another moral world. Within that simple exchange, the power dynamic shifted. These women, stripped of uniform and insignia, were no longer soldiers or enemies. They were simply human beings under care. That humanity carried moral tension of its own. Across Europe, atrocities committed by the Nazi regime were becoming known. Mass graves uncovered, death camps liberated. Many of the prisoners in Texas had heard whispers but could not comprehend the scale. Some denied it, others fell silent, unable to reconcile their service with the reality of genocide. For the American officers, the dilemma was different: how to extend decency to those who had served an inhuman cause. Yet discipline held firm. The Geneva Convention was not optional. U.S. commanders knew that how they treated their prisoners would shape the moral image of the post-war world. "We will not become what we fight," one officer wrote in his report. And so, even as the war raged in Europe, Texas remained an island of measured restraint. Cultural collision defined daily life inside the wire. For the women, America was overwhelming. A land of plenty in the middle of global scarcity. The camp kitchens served white bread and canned fruit. The guards drank coffee sweetened with real sugar. Small details struck deep. A bar of soap with a floral scent. The hum of a distant radio playing swing music. For those who had lived under rationing and propaganda, it felt like stepping into another civilization. Some began learning English from American newspapers, tracing letters in the dirt during spare hours. Others sang quietly in German at night, their voices soft against the crickets. Over time, the fence seemed less like a boundary of punishment and more like a fragile border between two worlds, the defeated and the free. And then came a day that tested that fragile border more than any other. The morning began with the whistle, of the camp bugle and the low hum of engines, warming on the perimeter. It was August 1944, one of the hottest summers Texas had ever endured. The air shimmered like glass. Inside the compound, the German women lined up outside the wooden barracks, their shadows long across the dust. They had been told that this day would bring a full inspection, medical, sanitary, and administrative. None of them knew exactly what it meant. For days, rumors had rippled through the camp. Some said it would be another delousing. Others whispered of deportation. Memories of Nazi inspection lines haunted them. Humiliation, fear, degradation disguised as discipline. Now, as American guards stood watch with calm detachment, the women braced themselves for the same. The order came from a young lieutenant, his tone crisp but not harsh. Through an interpreter, he explained that they were to remove their clothes for medical evaluation and fumigation. The prisoners obeyed in silence, eyes downcast. Boots thudded softly against the floorboards as garments were folded and handed over. The camp nurses, 2 American women in khaki uniforms, stood ready with masks and gloves. The first step was chemical fumigation. Clothing was placed inside metal chambers where DDT powder hissed through vents. The process was mechanical, impersonal, efficient. But to the women watching, it felt like another stripping away of self. One nurse, noticing a prisoner trembling uncontrollably, paused. She said nothing, just placed a towel over the woman's shoulders and guided her gently toward the wash area. That gesture, so simple and human, broke something inside the group. Fear turned into confusion, confusion into relief. Outside, the Texas wind rattled the tin roofs. Inside, the medics moved with professional rhythm, checking for lice, infections, and malnutrition. They spoke little, only what was necessary. Each woman passed through the line, her old uniform sealed in a crate for cleaning. When they emerged on the other side, they were handed packages wrapped in brown paper, a clean cotton dress, undergarments and canvas shoes, one of them, a 24-year-old radio operator from Bremen, later wrote in her diary, "They told us to undress. And I thought, this is the end of dignity. But then they gave us clothes that smelled of soap and flowers. I wanted to cry, not from shame, but from the weight of mercy. It was an act without ceremony, without speeches or ideology. But it carried the quiet power of contradiction. Everything these women had been told about Americans, cruelty, moral decay, arrogance, collapsed in that moment. Their captors had shown discipline without hatred, control without humiliation. Later that afternoon, when the inspection ended, the women were led back to their quarters. The guards remained at their posts, rifles slung low, watching but never jeering. The camp loudspeaker played faint music, an American swing tune that drifted over the barbed wire. One by one, the women began to relax. Some laughed nervously. Others simply stared at their clean hands, at the cotton fabric against their skin, unsure what to feel. That night, for the first time since capture, the barracks were filled with quiet conversation. The talk was not of escape or revenge, but of disbelief. "They treat us like people," one woman whispered. "They should hate us, but they do not." Another replied, "Maybe this is what victory looks like." In Washington, officials called these programs reorientation through example. But for those who lived it, it was something deeper. It was a moral confrontation, an unspoken lesson that humanity could survive even in war. Reports from Camp Hearn and other Texas facilities documented similar reactions. Prisoners began volunteering for camp work, assisting nurses, and even helping translate for new arrivals. Their behavior improved dramatically after these inspections. American officers noted a visible psychological shift. Hostility replaced by compliance, despair replaced by quiet gratitude. The act of giving clean clothes became symbolic. It wasn't a reward, it was a demonstration of principle. The U.S. military understood that the treatment of prisoners would echo across the post-war world. In Europe, the Soviets used brutality. The Americans used order. And in the heart of Texas, under a searing sun, that order took on an almost spiritual form. Days later, the women returned to work duty, field labor, sewing uniforms, maintaining barracks. The fear had not vanished, but it had transformed. They were still prisoners, but something intangible had changed. For the first time since the war began, many of them began to question the world they had come from. Years later, Historians would find testimonies from these camps, letters smuggled through the Red Cross, fragments of diaries, official inspection reports. They told a consistent story: captivity without cruelty, discipline without hate, and in those fragments lies the true turning point, not of battle, but of conscience. When the gates finally opened in 1946, and ships carried them back across the Atlantic, many of these women would tell their families of the strange kindness they had found in Texas. Few in ruined Germany believed them. Yet for those who lived it, the memory of that day, the order to undress, the gift of clean clothes, the sound of swing music drifting over the wire, would never leave them. It was not the end of captivity. It was the beginning of awakening. When the war ended in 1945, the quiet Texas camps began to empty. Ships waited at the Gulf ports, ready to carry the prisoners back across the Atlantic. For the German women, departure came with mixed emotions. They longed for home but dreaded what home had become. Letters that finally reached the camps spoke of bombed cities, missing families, and hunger. The world they had left no longer existed. American officers handed them repatriation papers, small allowances, and food rations for the voyage. Before boarding, each woman received one last package: a clean uniform, a Red Cross armband, and a folded note thanking them for their conduct. Many kept it hidden for years, fearing disbelief or ridicule in post-war Germany. In Europe, the returning prisoners found no welcome. To their compatriots, captivity in America was unimaginable luxury. Few wanted to hear of humane guards or fair treatment. Silence became survival. Diaries were burned, memories sealed away. Only decades later did historians uncover their testimonies in military archives and oral histories, echoes of a forgotten moral victory. The Texas camps were dismantled. The barracks sold as lumber, the fences left to rust under the sun. Nothing remained but open fields and faint outlines in the dust. Yet for those who had lived there, it was the place where hatred began to die, where defeat turned quietly into understanding. History often remembers the wars we fight, but not the mercy that survives within them. The story of the German women held in Texas is not one of victory or punishment. It is one of quiet defiance against the moral corrosion of war itself. Within fences meant for captivity, a different kind of liberation occurred. To be told to undress and then to be clothed again, this act, so simple and bureaucratic, carried an almost sacred symbolism. In Europe, uniforms defined identity: soldier, nurse, servant of the Reich. In Texas, stripped of those symbols, the women were seen for the first time as individuals, not instruments of ideology. The clean garments they received were not just replacements for worn uniforms. They were the fabric of renewal. The United States, despite its own flaws and prejudices, had chosen a path of principle. The Geneva Convention was not just a document. It was a mirror, reflecting the nation's commitment to remain civilized in an age that had lost its conscience. To treat the defeated with dignity was not weakness. It was a declaration of moral strength. The memory of that decency would linger long after the war's thunder faded. Many of the women who had lived behind the Texas wire later spoke of it as the first time they questioned everything they had believed about enemies and evil. For some, it became the seed of new faith. For others, a wound they could not explain to those who never saw the other side of the fence. In the silence of those camps, America demonstrated a truth that no victory parade could ever show: that civilization is not measured by how fiercely one fights, but by how gently one holds power when the fighting ends. The barbed wire rusted. The wind reclaimed the barracks, but the story endures, whispered through history's long corridors. A moment when compassion outlasted conflict, when mercy proved mightier than ideology. And somewhere in the vast stillness of the Texas plains, under the same sun that once watched prisoners step down from a train, the faint echo remains: the sound of fabric rustling, of fear turning into trust, of a war-weary world learning, for one brief moment, how to be human again.